Hello, everyone. I hope that you all are well and taking care of yourselves amid the global pandemic. I'm Adrienne Sutton, an oceanographer at NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Lab in Seattle in the US. In this presentation, I'll be focusing on the opportunities that new technologies bring to our effort to better constrain ocean uptake of CO2. This work is in collaboration with many partners. Several of them are listed here. And the new technologies I'll be focusing on are air and seawater surface PCO2 observing technology paired with autonomous or uncrewed surface vehicles like the wave glider that's shown here in this photo. The sailed drone shown here is an example of another ASV and CO2 technology integration. And the main take-home message for this talk is that data and knowledge gaps are limiting our ability to improve estimates of the ocean CO2 sink. However, new technology developed over the last decade puts us in a position to implement a game-changing increase in air-sea CO2 observations. The ocean plays a key role in the climate system, absorbing about a quarter of CO2 emissions every year. Observations of surface ocean CO2 support several questions around the changing role of the ocean in the climate system. Questions like whether ocean CO2 uptake will continue to keep pace with the atmospheric CO2 increase and provide the level of mitigation to the buildup of atmospheric CO2 that we've all become accustomed to. How will the carbon cycle change if and when carbon dioxide removal approaches are implemented at scale? Will the ocean uptake of CO2 continue as primarily an abiotic process? And what is the role of biology in the ocean carbon cycle and how is it changing? Many of these questions are being asked as part of a coordinated ocean carbon research and observing plan that Chris Sabine is talking about during the same session. This figure from the 2019 global carbon budget shows 3 different ways of estimating ocean CO2 uptake. From the decadal scale measurements of the ocean interior shown in red, global ocean biogeochemical models in green, and from measurements from methods based on surface ocean PCO2 measurements from the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas, or SOCAT, that's shown in cyan. There's been a lot of work in the past couple decades to reduce the uncertainty in all these estimates. In this session, Galen McKinley will be talking about work to assess whether the different assumptions made in deriving each of these estimates leads to the discrepancies we see between the various approaches that you can see in this figure. But during this talk, my focus is on the contributions of surface ocean observations to constraining CO2 flux. And there's been a lot of success with reducing the uncertainty in this method as well, which was done primarily through continued efforts to develop and refine best practices for measurements and community level data quality control coordinated through SOCAT, as well as better methods for interpolating sparse observations into global gridded products. But are we approaching a limit in improving these estimates because of our observing gaps in the network? And how can new technologies developed over the past decade address this problem? If you're tuning into this session, you're probably familiar with this figure of sources and sinks in the global carbon budget and the budget imbalance that's shown in light gray. One question we have is whether some of this budget imbalance is due to poor constraint of the ocean sink. This figure on the right is from Greger et al., and it's based on about 35 years of data in SOCAT and gives you a sense for where we have observing gaps and how seasonally constrained the data are. The large data gaps in the Southern Hemisphere and the seasonal bias in some regions is the result of a network reliant on ships, primarily research and cargo vessels that operate at higher density in the Northern Hemisphere. New to the SOCAT data product over the last 10 years has been the incorporation of buoy-based surface ocean PCO2 observations, which provide high temporal resolution, including full seasonal constraint at key locations. But buoys also rely on regional ship capacity, and so the network of buoys also tends to be Northern Hemisphere biased. But another exciting development over the last 10 years has been ASVs, some of which don't require ships for deployment or recovery. And for this reason, we've adapted the buoy-based air-sea CO2 technology for use on ASVs, which we've deployed over a range of latitudes and ocean basins, so shown here. This technology includes an equilibration-based method that's similar to the most common approach used on ships. The major difference is that we are doing the equilibration directly in the surface water. The equilibrator here that's circled in red is the only part of the CO2 system that's in the water. Seawater CO2 is measured by bubbling an air sample in the seawater for 10 minutes. So the CO2 in that air sample comes into equilibration with CO2 in the seawater. That equilibrator is shown at the bottom of the diagram on the right. And if you go up from that equilibrator, you can see that the air sample is then partially dried and run through an infrared sensor to measure the CO2 concentration. We also measure a sample directly from the air, and each measurement is calibrated with a 0 and a high CO2 reference gas in situ. This technology has been used on buoys since as early as 1998 and is now deployed on over 50 buoys globally. And in the last 10 years, it's been deployed on over about 24 ASVs. And the latest version of SOCAT includes data from many of these ASV missions. Fixed time series excel at questions about temporal variability and change. So at these buoy sites, we make 3-hourly measurements. So we used these highly resolved data sets to determine the length of observing records needed to detect an anthropogenic trend at these sites. And we find that this can be as short as a decade at open ocean sites like the two shown here, the 2 time series, and up to 4 decades at highly variable coastal sites. We've also used these data sets to determine what months shellfish larvae are likely to be exposed to corrosive aragonite saturation state conditions in the upper water column. Like in the Gulf of Maine, where the confluence of warming and ocean acidification is creating a situation where the spawning season of the soft-shelled clam may begin to overlap with conditions harmful to larval survival in the springtime. In another session, Sophie Chu will be presenting similar work on the west coast of the US. And finally, these buoy time series have also allowed us to do event monitoring in real time. And Nikki Lewandowski will present an example of this in a model-based assessment of the ocean response to COVID-related emission reductions using the buoy data as validation. But with ASVs, we can combine high-frequency observations, not just in time, but also in space. One of the more extreme tests of the sail drone ASV was during a deployment last year in the Southern Ocean. That was the first autonomous circumnavigation of Antarctica. Sorry, but I can't seem to get this video to run for you. Because this mission allowed for rare measurements of co-located wind and air-sea CO2, we used this deployment to better constrain uncertainty in different approaches to calculating CO2 flux. While float-based approaches for estimating CO2 flux do have a larger uncertainty, the biogeochemical float estimates for wintertime flux in the Antarctic zone, shown here at the bottom in gray, were similar to the ASV CO2 flux estimates shown in red. However, the large interannual variability that you can see in this figure that the floats have measured in this zone are significant and point to the need for expanded observations in this region to better understand the scale and drivers of this interannual variability. Wave gliders have also been deployed in the Southern Ocean since 2012. The Southern Ocean Seasonal Cycle Experiment has been utilizing a wave glider to make air-sea CO2 observations at 2 locations in the Atlantic sector, shown in this map here on the right. Both the wave glider experiment and the sail drone mission found that sampling period can have a significant impact on CO2 flux estimates, given the variability of surface ocean PCO2 in this region. Hourly sampling of ASVs can reduce the uncertainty by up to around 25 to 30% compared to a 10-day sampling period of biogeochemical floats, for example. Work is also being done at these sites to understand the link between mixed layer physics and the variability of CO2 flux. And this really highlights the need for linking ASVs with subsurface platforms like gliders and floats for building a complete picture of the drivers of variability and the scales at which we need to sample and utilize in developing our observation-based data products. In recent years, the ocean carbon community has also been paying more attention to how the choice of satellite-based wind speed products impacts CO2 flux uncertainty. While all CO2 flux estimates are equally impacted by the uncertainty in the gas transfer velocity across the air-sea interface, the choice and availability of wind speed, seawater PCO2 and air PCO2, can lead to variation among different approaches to estimating CO2 flux. The dots in this figure show how choice of CCMP, ERA, or NCEP wind speed impacts the CO2 flux estimate in different regions. And in this analysis, the Southern Ocean and Tropical Pacific really jump out as regions where the different satellite-based wind products diverge the most. So to wrap up, societal decision-making around forecasts of severe weather, ecosystem health, and the ocean's role in climate change is dependent on our understanding of air-sea exchange of CO2, but not just CO2, heat, moisture, momentum, aerosols. There were several OceanObs 19 community papers that identified the need to scale up shovel-ready technology like ASVs to build a globally distributed array of air-sea observations. And many of these discussions continue as big ideas, or what some are calling ocean shots, like the idea of a moonshot, are being further developed. This is a really important challenge, as the integration of these types of observations could contribute to our understanding of ocean carbon climate feedbacks and to strengthening the integration of models and observations. The technology development work over the last decade that I talked about today provides us the opportunity to meet a lot of these challenges. That's all I have for today, and I hope to see some of you during the virtual session. Take care.